Trauma Therapist Podcast, episode 479. All right, guys, welcome to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to raise awareness of trauma and to support new trauma therapists just starting out on their trauma-informed journey. I do that through this podcast and my membership community, Trauma Therapist 2.0. If you're a therapist of any kind, interested in learning about trauma, and you're looking for support and inspiration, I invite you to check out Trauma Therapist 2.0 by going to traumatherapist2.com. That's traumatherapist, the number 2.com. All right, let's get started. Several years ago when I was in graduate school and just starting seeing clients, I was doing a lot of commuting, like an hour and a half each way to my site. I was always thinking about my clients. What am I doing? I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what the heck I'm doing. Why didn't I do that? Why I should have done that? And I always thought to myself, wouldn't it be awesome if I had a seasoned master trauma therapist sitting right there beside me in the passenger seat? Well, obviously that didn't happen. So I created the program, and it's Trauma Therapist 2.0. It's my online community specifically dedicated for new trauma workers. If that's you, if you're just starting out on this trauma-informed journey, you're passionate about this work, and you're looking to gain confidence, you're looking to share your journey, share your challenges, and share your wins to get inspiration, also to help to inspire others, I want to invite you to check out Trauma Therapist 2.0 by going to traumatherapist2.com. That's traumatherapist, the number 2.com. All right, guys, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. Very excited to have as my guest back today, Dr. Shauna Springer. Shauna, welcome.
Thank you. It's really good to be here.
All right. So Dr. Springer is a graduate of Harvard University and is one of the world's leading experts on PTSD, trauma, and moral injury among veterans. She co-hosts a weekly podcast on these topics in collaboration with MilitaryTimes. Her work has been featured on NPR, NBC, CBS Radio, Forbes, Washington Post, and MilitaryTimes, and she's a regular contributor to Psychology Today. All right, Shauna, welcome back. It's a pleasure to have you. I know you've got books out and podcasts out, and you're doing a lot of stuff, but we'll get to those. But first of all, welcome back. And how are you doing given the situation and times we're in right now?
Yeah, I'm doing pretty well overall. Never been busier, actually. My kids are suddenly being homeschooled, and they are on a fast track to sending inappropriate videos to their teachers, I would say, of just unscripted, things like that. But we are actually both working really hard. My husband and I, we're both psychologists. So we're doing a lot of work to try and look out for the people that we serve right now, and trying to make it all work as best we can.
So what I didn't mention in your bio, and I do want to mention, is your most recent book, which is titled Warrior: How to Support Those Who Protect Us. And, wanted to bring you back on here to talk about that. So that was recently published. When was that published?
So that has just gotten posted on Barnes & Noble and Amazon.
Okay.
The publication date is in May. But people are able to pre-order them right now, and I expect they'll be going out really any day now.
Okay.
It's the most important book I've ever written, and I'm grateful to you for asking about it because, obviously I didn't plan the timing for this. I wrote this book out of 10 years working with our nation's warfighters and their families about the kinds of trauma and the complicated nature of that trauma, to kind of bridge that experience with everyday civilians who might not have experienced those kinds of traumas. And what has happened now with the pandemic health threat is that most Americans are now beginning to experience traumas that are very well, are familiar to our military veterans and service members. And so the book is really relevant to understanding a lot of what is currently unfolding. And it's also just the most important thing I feel I've ever written in support of warfighters and their families.
Before we dive into it, Shauna, share with our listeners briefly why this topic is important for you, how you got into working with vets and so forth.
Yeah. So I would say that, I had a kind of unusual upbringing that made the military feel like home to me. The way that I was raised was, 5 a.m. jogs around the track. We competed in local track meets. We were sent abroad to do a lot of travel on our own, doing service trips down in South America. So having been exposed to different cultures and uncomfortable situations and different ways of life and seeing how people cope in the midst of adversity was something that was a very strong theme throughout my entire early childhood. So when I started working with warriors and their families, it just felt like home to me.
Mm.
And it became really, as we talked about on the first podcast we did, the power of trust. It's not a job to me. It's really my calling. And it's a sacred calling to me. And so writing this book was basically taking a decade of work at the extremes and scaling those insights that I learned from all of those warfighters and their families who trusted me.
So before we get to that, so what is it? You woke up, your dad woke you up and let's go. We're going for a 5 a.m. jog or run?
Yeah. Yeah, basically. It
Wow.
was dark outside, and 3 times a week he would get us up, my sister, my brother, and myself. We would sometimes run to the track and sometimes load up in our truck and go down there, and we'd run miles in the dark.
Was
And
he
then
military?
what?
Was he military?
No, he wasn't.
Wow.
He had a choice. He was either going to go to Harvard or Annapolis, and he went the Harvard route. But I'll be darned if he didn't raise us like a Marine Corps drill instructor. I will tell
Wow.
you, Guy, that his favorite book was The Great Stantini.
Okay.
Um, and so I think, he used that as a parenting manual and felt like that is, that really lit up his brain and made him gave him a model for how to raise
Right.
us, for better or
Right.
worse.
So for those who are listening, when we're talking about these times, we're talking about COVID-19, which is, we're in the midst of it right now.
Yeah.
So let's dive into this book here. And when you reference the word warrior, what does that mean to you? Are you using that interchangeably with veterans?
No, I'm not. And I kind of evolved that understanding throughout the book. For example, I've never served in the military and would not want to represent that I have. But as I've done this work, I have seen that there are different ways to be a warrior. To me, the warrior is somebody who takes the hard path that is consistent with the values they hold sacred, the values that they would die for in battle. And so some of the people I've worked with have been warrior wives, have been medics and docs, and even healers that have never served in the military, but who have built that trust and developed themselves to the place where they take on challenges. And so I think there are many ways to be a warrior. That gets really important after discharge because some people feel like that is a death, to lose their identity. And so a good bit of my work in my last book, Beyond the Military, was about helping people realize that there are ways to be a warrior after military service. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So, let's unfold that. So,
Okay.
and talk more about why you wrote this book.
I wrote this book out of frustration with myself 10 years ago. When I came into the VA system, I was idealistic. I was brimming with optimism, and I thought I knew what I knew. I had been socialized in graduate school to feel like I had expertise and I had all of this knowledge that I had suffered in my own way through graduate school to learn. And we suffer in our own ways in graduate school. It's different than the military. But coming in as a doctor and saying, I know how to treat trauma, I quickly got cut down by the patients that were there waiting for me. And I will always remember one of them said, what are you, like 25 years old? Why do they keep hiring these people that have no idea what it's like to serve? And so that really kind of cut me down to size and made me feel so much shame that maybe I didn't have what it takes to serve the people that I really wanted to support, that felt to me like home, and that they didn't feel that way about me at first, for sure, especially that first week. And so what it did was it really made me take a deep look at how I build trust with this warfighter population, what it requires. I was just talking this morning with a psychologist who works out in with the Special Forces group, and we had a really fun conversation. And it basically was how, coming in with expertise, it just doesn't play well. And the only way to really connect and build that trust that we talked about on our last podcast here is to come in and take your armor off and step around the system of rank and hierarchy and just walk with them as a healer. And so learning to do that is really part of what the book is about.
I love that. All right. So let's get into it here. And you talked about, I think before we started recording, how almost synchronistically, in a sense, it really melds with the experience we're going through now with COVID, in a sense.
Yeah, it does. So, for example, a lot of people would say that veterans or service members are traumatized by what they see in war, these exposures. And I found that that really wasn't the source of trauma for most of my patients, that there are these more lethal, more insidious forms of trauma than what we think about when we think about PTSD. And when I say that, Americans are now beginning to understand this. If you think about all the parallels, this kind of chronic hypervigilance that we have to always be aware with a life or death stakes, that, we have to be so careful. And there's this external threat, but it's invisible. And you have to worry about whether it's going to, hit your family and your friends, or if you lose somebody, there's cut off grief because you can't even be in the same room with them. So you're losing people that you love, and you can't be with them. There are all these parallels in terms of this process. And it's almost like, when somebody goes into the war zone, they enter an alternate society with very, very different rules, where people around them are hypervigilant and fearful, and they know what can happen. And those rules are different. And now American society as a whole has kind of gone quickly into this alternate society, where we are beginning to look at each other with suspicion and distrust as potentially a threat. That is not a feeling Americans are used to, but it's a feeling that's unfortunately very familiar to many who serve, and it has nothing to do with what they see and do in war, necessarily in some cases.
So what does that mean for those of us who haven't served, who aren't serving? Is how do we develop that awareness?
I think recognizing that this is ground that's been traveled by our strongest and our bravest, and that no one is immune to risk is very important. People talk about the increased risk of suicide in the military and veteran population. To me, the angle on that has always been, if our strongest and bravest can die by suicide, then we should be humble about the fact that none of us is immune to risk. And understanding what puts us at risk and how we can overcome that risk and reckon directly with mental warfare then becomes the thing to focus on.
So in terms of the book, break it down a little more specifically about how you organized the book.
Okay. So the first few chapters are a little bit about how I came in as Dr. Springer and why I don't really care about that title so much anymore. But when a veteran or service member calls me Doc Springer, that means a lot to me. It says something about the trust. And so I really have seen people who work with the military and warfighter population as either doctors or docs. And the doctors are the ones who think they know what they know, and they fail to engage their patients, their warfighters, in care disproportionately. The docs are the ones that build that trust that we talked about. And so, you can hear the maybe the lawnmower of the neighbor in the background, like a recent thing now that we're all working out of home. So the doctors and docs distinction is important. I developed that. And then I talk about our whole model of trauma and how it really misses the mark for so much of what I worked with when I had that trust. And then I talk about how in the area of suicide prevention, we really might be asking the wrong questions and taking the wrong approach. That the story of why many of our warriors die by suicide is not the same as the story of why civilians may die by suicide.
All right, folks, I want to thank my sponsor, Talkspace. We are living in an upside down world. We all know it, and if you've been waiting months to figure out what your future is going to look like, you're not alone. Between the uncertainty of waiting for answers, the stressors of school, of work. I'm suddenly find myself with 2 young kids at home, and that itself is a challenge. There's so much to balance. If anything helps reduce stress and anxiety, it's talking it out. We all know it. Talkspace has thousands of licensed therapists trained in over 40 specialties, including anxiety, depression, relationship issues, and more. If you have something you want to work on, if you have something you feel you want to reach out and talk to someone about, reach out to Talkspace. It's a fraction of the cost of in-person therapy. And you can send unlimited text messages, and you will be able to engage with your therapist at least 5 days a week. And that means never having to wait. Look, as a listener of the Trauma Therapist Podcast, you get $100 off your first month on Talkspace. So go to Talkspace.com or download the app and make sure to use the code word Trauma Therapist to get $100 off your first month and show support for this podcast. Once again, go to Talkspace.com or download the app and make sure to use the code Trauma Therapist to get $100 off your first month. All right.
So then I follow those, pathways and talk about.
Okay, wait. All of these headings are like, I have so many questions. They're so juicy in and of themselves. You talked about how we're off in terms of understanding the model of trauma, and then this idea of understanding why individuals are committing suicide. Both of those are podcast episodes unto themselves, but pick one of those, or even if you want to continue on with your explanation about the book. But there's just so much here that I didn't want to let go.
Yeah. Well, thanks. Yeah. Thanks for bringing me back. I have so much that I want to say, and that's why I'm so excited about this book, because it's all in there. But let's take the suicide risk one, because that feels really urgent to me right now. I read something this morning that was put out by the American Association of Suicidology that between 20 and 40,000 people a day are coming to ERs because of psychological reasons right now, a day. Wow. So, we're facing this sort of tidal wave of stress, and suicide risk would logically be increased during times of a perfect storm of stress. We know that. And so even if the data lags a little bit, here's the thing, the story is different. So a lot of times, in the civilian population, the question we're asking is, Guy, let me close my window because somebody has an unauthorized gardener out and they're really loud. All right. Trying to concentrate with all of this. All right. So let me just jump back in and give it to you in a kind of way you can make a cut maybe. So let's talk about suicide for a second, suicide risk. So the fact that many of our strongest and bravest are at risk and have a heightened risk means that none of us are immune. And yet that doesn't mean that the story is the same. Many of our suicide prevention interventions are based on the question, how do I prevent myself from taking my own life? How do I stop myself if I'm in a crisis? How do I soothe myself? How do I distract myself when I'm in distress? And that is not a very compelling question for those who are wired to be warriors. They are, by definition, not very self-protective. They are protective of those that they love and the values they would die for in battle. So the whole philosophy that we use to approach suicide prevention needs a radical overhaul. in the case of warfighters. We're asking the wrong question. The question should not be, how do I save myself when I'm distressed? It should be, how do I protect those I love and honor my sacred values? Draw from my tribe so that I can stay in the fight because of what I value and who I love. And that is a different line of intervention. It's an important nuance that can change the way that we approach suicide prevention. And so I'll be working on some projects that will be advancing that line of thinking.
Can you repeat that question again?
Yeah. So the question should be, how do I protect those I love and honor the values I hold sacred? Because the people you love and the values you hold sacred, the things you would give your life for in battle, for warfighters, are the same things that have stopping power when it comes to mental warfare.
Yeah, I mean, it's a completely different question, which begs or demands a completely different, almost intervention in a sense,
Yeah.
right? So, in turn, if that initial question, that kind of incorrect or maybe misaligned question is being asked often of these individuals, what is happening? How, or maybe let me ask you a different question. How is the second question that you posed, what is that doing? How is that landing? What is it inviting the recipient, the veteran, to do or to ask of themselves in a sense?
Yeah. So that second question honors their sacred values and their core identity. It is aligned with their value, their culture, and their language. If you ask a veteran, how can I help you come up with a plan to stop yourself when you're distressed, to soothe yourself so we can save your own life? That's not a very compelling intervention for them. But if you honor their identity by seeing that they are protectors and that they are people who protect those they love from outcomes that they want to avoid, then you can dig in with them and really define those people and those values that they would be willing to die for in battle. Once you have that, you have what you need to help them see that the thought that your loved ones are better off without you is the fundamental lie that drives suicide behavior. That there is a tactical understanding you can develop of how your demons will try to persuade you of that. It's predictable. There are certain themes in those conversations in your head that, for example, I've done a lot of reunions with veterans, and I've had them write on a card, what are your voices of despair? What are your demons? However you want to say it. What do they tell you? And there are themes. It's predictable. They say, you're not worthy of the brotherhood. Or they say, you are a threat to your family's future. Or you are the problem. You're the monster that needs to go. That's where they get into danger, when they see themselves as the threat. And then they move to take themselves out, because that's what they are wired to do and trained to do. So you have to get in there and really help them transform that understanding. And you won't be able to do it if you're using the standard logic of how do we save you? How do we save your life? Help you save your own life? That's not a compelling question for someone who's a protector. Does that make sense?
It does. And how did this come about? How did you realize this?
I realized it because I had one of those 3 a.m. nights where it was, one of my dark nights of the soul. And I was really worried about losing some of my patients. And I realized that I had had 2 groups of near-death experiences in my patients. One of them had nearly had their lives taken from them in the combat zone, and the other who had attempted to end their lives and then come to see me after that. And the themes were very different, diametrically opposed in those 2 groups. And those who nearly had their lives taken from them were very much in touch with their sacred values and the people that they loved in those moments that could have been lethal. They would get like a mental visitation of a spouse that would say, I need you to come home. Or a Marine who died 2 weeks earlier who said, you don't have permission to die. Our brothers need you. or a kid that would say, I need you to come home, Dad. I need you to make it. And so they were in touch with and attuned to that connection in what should have been their last moments. And that gave them the will to stay in the fight through what should have been lethal injuries. So that was that theme. And in the group where they nearly lost their lives by their own hand, it was a very different theme. In that group, they were profoundly disconnected from the voices of those they love and from those sacred values. And they had really been converted into a belief that they were the threat or they were the monster that needed to go for their family's protection.
No.
And once I realized that theme, I kind of had the insight psychologically around where they were getting into like a really high risk mode and dropping into a tactical threat removal behavioral sequence. So that's where we need to kind of get in there, I think, with them. And I've developed tools and interventions in collaboration with combat war fighters to do just that.
Oh. So continuing on with the kind of outline of the book, if you will, you talked about, talking about your transition in a sense from Dr. Springer to Doc Springer, and the understanding of the understanding of the trauma model, and then this question in a sense, what explain beyond that?
Yeah. Some of the other chapters that I have in there are about the power of connection, but there's a lot of paradox in connection, especially in the population that I serve. So I'll give you a story. I was with a large group of Marines, and I wanted to test something that I had heard about in my clinical office. And so I said, raise your hand if there is somebody in this room that you love like family that you once hated on sight. And hands shot up all over the room. There is an opposite of love at first sight, which is hate at first sight. And this was very common. And in fact, many of the people who considered themselves brothers had a knockdown, drag-out fight the first time they met. So that was interesting. And so from that, I started to think about, how do we build trust? If it's not a function of personality compatibility, what produces trust, and how do we build and hold that trust? And then how can we do that with those that love us at home, or those that would help to walk with us when we get back from the war, who have never themselves served in the military, but might be trustworthy and helpful in our healing process nonetheless.
Wow. This is fascinating. And as you're talking, you just feel how much the compassion you have for these individuals.
Well, they, now that I've gotten out of a strictly clinical role, I have degrees of freedom to go out to their reunions and walk with them in a different way. When this whole COVID thing broke out, I was down in LA. I had just done a really interesting pilot with several Marines in my network where we had gone to Chicago. They had gotten this stellate ganglion block injection that resets their adrenaline system and allows them to benefit from insight and growth in a different way because they're no longer in like that fight or flight survival mode. And then we took them right into a really thoughtful aftercare program. And I was there with them for the whole week. And so COVID happened, and the staff that were supporting us left the campus, went home, and they all voted to, those that were there said, let's finish out the week. This is the most impactful thing we've ever done. And so getting to walk with them in that space, many of whom I've known for many years, that have been just some of my best friends and my partners in not only healing themselves, but they are the people that have trusted me and given me the insights that I've accumulated and written up in my book. That's why it's so valuable. It's not really ever been about my story. I'm not the hero of the story. I'm somebody that they have trusted. And so I've walked with many, many of our war fighters and have collected their insights and present them for the benefit of not only other war fighters, but the families who love them, the healers and healthcare systems that want to support them, everyday Americans who want to support them. And now, because that trauma is being echoed in the COVID crisis, it's full of insight that we can all use right now about the nature of trauma and what keeps us in the fight.
Yeah. I just want to remind everyone that I'm speaking with Shauna Springer. She can be reached at DocShaunaSpringer.com. And the book, where can people get the book?
Warrior, How to Support Those Who Protect Us is now available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and Nook as well, I'm told.
Okay. And we'll have that linked up at the show notes page here at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. Shauna, you're just so friggin' inspiring to talk to. You really are. I mean, you can feel, that's why I do this. I get to talk to people like you. You just exude this compassion for the work you're doing. And it's a pleasure having you back on here.
Thank you. It's a calling to me. And I know that in graduate school, it's hard for us to imagine talking about the love that we have for the people we serve. But there is a variant of love, which is born out of a deep respect. And that is what fuels me in this calling.
Yeah. Well, you can feel it. Thank you so much for coming back. All right. Take care.
Take care. Bye.
All right. Thank you so much for checking out the podcast. I really appreciate it. And if you're a new trauma therapist, if you're a student, if you're passionate about learning about trauma, if you're just starting out on your trauma-informed journey, I want to invite you to check out my membership community, Trauma Therapist 2.0. It's specifically dedicated to therapists of all kinds who are just starting out, who want to be around other people who are doing this work, who are passionate about learning and learning from seasoned professionals. Check out Trauma Therapist 2.0. That's traumatherapist2.com. Traumatherapist2.com. All right. Have a great day.